Welcome to the Barbell Strategy Podcast,
where we talk about coaching,
training,
and all things strength and conditioning
to help the fitness athlete,
CrossFitter, and the coach. Please share and enjoy.
Okay, so continuing on with our theme of strength for this series, what we're going to be talking about is how strong do you need to be? Because I think one of the things we've been talking about over this season has been, when people are overemphasizing their strength and might be focusing too much on it at the wrong stages in their development, and obviously getting strong takes a considerable amount of effort, and sometimes getting too strong is going to be a wasted effort when you could be creating a little bit more of a well-rounded athlete within your programming. So we're going to speak to a little bit more around specific numbers, what people need to have at different stages within their sort of life cycle as an athlete. But one of the things that we will be touching on is definitely the importance of understanding the different types of strength. So you may have absolute strength where we're expressing sort of our 1 rep maxes, but then we obviously have strength where we are able to hit those numbers under fatigue, and we have strength endurance and these types of qualities. So first up, what we'll do is we'll just go over, we'll start at the top really. So Sam, what are some of the things that you think the top CrossFit Games athletes are doing within their strength and how they're expressing that in competition, and how that might differ from someone who is going to be an intermediate level athlete, someone who is on a competitor's program? What are the type of things as a coach you would be looking to try and develop for those athletes versus someone on that sort of more beginner intermediate level?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, advanced athletes, whether that's games level or just people they've spent a significant amount of time doing Olympic weightlifting or developing their strength. You would like to think by the time they reach that level, they've got a very good technical or level of technical ability with the movements. So the time that you will spend developing technique is obviously a lot less. There might be small tweaks that you might be making, but they're not going to have as big of an impact on their performance as, say, a beginner or even an intermediate athlete, depending on where they're at. So that opens up more options in terms of what you can do when you looking to develop those things with them. And you're going to work with it across a much broader spectrum. So looking at obviously 1 rep maxes, things like that, but obviously also like the barbell cycling, the strength endurance side of things. But also a big one, which I think especially when you're competing at a high level, is obviously this idea of having like a minimum number that you always feel confident hitting, and building consistency around that kind of number. Because I think, especially if you're looking at, say, the CrossFit Games, the way that they structure the workouts and the events, there's no guarantee whether you're going to be hitting that number or hitting a 1 rep max with any level of freshness whatsoever. You might have just finished a 5k run and then you're into a 1 rep max lift. But I think as well, the way that some workouts are programmed, and it'll depend on where you sit within the top level of athletes in terms of your top numbers. But obviously some of the workouts that we see where you've got, cleans starting off at 100 kilos for guys and finishing on 150 kilos for guys, with other movements in between, it's being able to still express that strength well there. But then as well, when we see things like speed ladders, when you've got 5 lifts to do and ideally you're hitting those lifts within 15-20 seconds of one another with increasing weights, then again, that's something that needs to be worked on if you want to compete at that highest level, as opposed to just looking purely at your 1 rep max. Because again, like at, say, the CrossFit Games, you don't know which of those things you're going to get. You might get one of them, none of them, or all of them. So it's being able to express that strength really well across all the different domains that is going to separate you in a competition at that level.
It's almost a little bit like World's Strongest Man, because they obviously have like all those different setups and everything like that, but rather than say odd objects and stones and that type of stuff, you're looking at barbells and all of these different setups, and you can add a run in there. I remember seeing that workout from the games a couple of years ago. I think it was maybe like 200 or 400 meter runs with some heavy cleans and the runs, you could see people just taking it super easy and then just going to town on the cleans. And I've even done that. I think there was a one qualifier workout once where it was overhead squats getting even increasing, and I think I was holding something like on the rows that I had to do like maybe 10-15 calories between. It was something like 800 calories per hour, like per hour pace, because I was like, nope, I'm just gonna save all this for that.
That's it. And that's being smart, and that's playing to your strengths in a workout perhaps, but also especially with something like that, you could row twice as fast and gain 2 or 3 seconds because the calories are so short anyway.
Yeah, what is it worth?
So
Yeah. One thing that has been good to see over the recent years in the games is just the use of I suppose a sandbag, right? Heavy sandbag type stuff. And just seeing a little bit more diversity in terms of the type of strength. Because there was a time, I think, when maybe the average games athlete maybe was a bit stronger. I don't know. The average games athlete now is a lot bigger as well than they used to be. So let's say stronger relative to body weight, or just there was definitely a certain type of like barbell specialist athlete who was at the games more often. But I think one of the things we've got a couple of numbers here. One of the things which is quite interesting, and this is sort of comparing the max numbers in the powerlifting world with the max numbers in the CrossFit world of individuals in sort of like equivalent weight categories. So taking the world records of a certain weight category and then comparing them to the CrossFit Games athletes. CrossFit Games athletes are looking at, for their power lifts, so let's squat, bench and then deadlift, 60%. So 60% compared to of what a world-class raw powerlifter would be able to hit. And then if we do the same when we look at Olympic weightlifting and we compare those numbers, roughly it's about 80%. So we can see there's a bias towards a certain type of strength, and that is weightlifting, which I don't think that's contested anymore, but it might not necessarily be reflected in people's training. We may see still a big emphasis on trying to increase numbers, like back squat numbers and this type of stuff. I think one of the interesting things I find is with CrossFitters is that you do have these outliers amongst the elite who will still PB on their lifts, years and years and years, but that's not the norm. And I think that once people do get to a certain strength level, then it's about just trying to be able to express that with all of the other work, and trying to be able to demonstrate that strength with as much as taking on as much volume and as much fatigue in as possible, while still being able to demonstrate those numbers. Sometimes you even still see people going for squat cycles and this type of stuff, which can be something which might bump up your strength back to, say, numbers that are like closer to your max. But I think there's an expectation that if you put some concerted effort into those individual lifts, whether it be a squat cycle or a bench press cycle or something like that, it's almost like, you should be hitting a PR after this or a PB after this, which I don't necessarily think is the case. And I think sometimes if you can be okay with, not necessarily actually having to PB, and you're a little bit more concerned of like just getting your numbers back to a pretty good level, whilst also being able to do all the other things you've been working on. Like if you're able to get to that level, you're in a good spot. You don't necessarily need to have that sort of material increase on that number for you to sort of be progressing as an athlete. You can still progress as an athlete, keep your numbers around the same. They might fluctuate a little bit, but it's about trying to obviously make sure that you're as well-rounded as possible with those strengths.
Yeah, definitely. But why do you think, if you say obviously when it comes to Olympic weightlifting, CrossFitters can get within 80% of world records, why do you think it's only 60% on the power lifts, even if people are still doing their squat cycles and things like that in their training?
I think so. There's a skill component within weightlifting which doesn't exist in powerlifting. If you look at the training of powerlifters, some notoriously train 4 days a week. The amount of stress, I mean, I'm not going to go down the sort of special sports supplements conversation, because I feel like that's like sort of prevalent everywhere, but that would probably just open up a can of worms. But I do think that with Olympic weightlifting, there's more of a skill aspect to it. If you look at the frequency that weightlifters train, it's more towards, let's say, 6 to, I don't know, potentially up to 12 sessions per week at the elite level. And that's maybe a little bit more akin to, you know, what we see with CrossFitters. CrossFitters are going to snatch and clean and jerk more often. They're going to get touches on those movements when they're going through barbell cycling work. I think one of the interesting things these days is you see in the performance world, the use, or I see in sort of strength and conditioning world, the use of things like touch and go work, which is a quote unquote sport specific skill for CrossFit, but people are using it for strength and conditioning to apply more stress to training certain speed and more power qualities that are involved in Olympic lifts, to sort of try and generate more speed on the eccentric, which then creates more power on the concentric and that type of stuff. So yeah, you could say maybe there's elements of the training that CrossFitters do which is actually pretty applicable to maybe the S&C for weightlifters. Yeah. I do remember actually one weightlifting coach saying that a lot of the women who are coming into weightlifting in the States and competing in that, they may have a background in CrossFit or they may have a background in gymnastics, and this really sort of like lends itself very well to having good strength in the split jerk. It's just like one little anecdote. But one of the things you see as well is, you know, and you see this on the women's side, but like women at the CrossFit Games will compete at an international level in weightlifting. You don't see that on the men's side. No. Right? Like no. You got Guy is like he's not. I'm not too sure how far away he is from being able to compete on the international level. You probably could actually, but you just don't see it on the same scale. Whereas I think Laura Hovarth, I think she competed at like Europeans maybe, like back when they were this year. So that's one thing to also note as well. And that's probably a little bit more around the culture of training, you could say, and just the exposure of weightlifting, and the exposure of weightlifting amongst women in, you know, certain parts of the world as well.
I mean, I think obviously with powerlifting as well, the absolute numbers that they're lifting at that high level, they are incredibly high, and the amount of fatigue that you get from training and lifting those kind of weights on a regular basis, I feel like with everything else that CrossFitters are doing in a week, they would just burn out if they were trying to really chase those numbers and keep doing what they're doing. I just don't think their bodies would let them do it. And then plus obviously like the injuries that might come from that too, I feel like that contributes to making it so much harder for CrossFitters when it comes to developing the power lifts to a really elite level. Whereas I think with Olympic weightlifting, you know, the absolute loads are lower. I think we practice it more because even though we might do, you know, a heavy snatch or clean session once or twice a week, there's a good chance you've then also done them in a metcon at least once or twice a week at varying loads, and you're just exposed to it so much more. And I think that helps close the gap. But I also think as well with CrossFitters, there's just that it's a bigger target to chase a lot of the time. People talk more about their 1 rep max Olympic lift, say snatch or clean and jerk, whatever, a lot more than they talk about their 1 rep max deadlift, and put a lot more effort into developing it.
But like if, let's say for example, I mean logistically as well, it's a lot easier for competitions to be holding maxes of a certain lift rather than, you know, having to do something that requires a rack, or if it's a deadlift, it requires like all the plates, right? Plates. I think we would definitely, you know, there's definitely competitions that throw out there sometimes, you know, 1 rep maxes for your power lifts, but I mean they did it in quarterfinals. They did, was it the other total, which is bench press, overhead squat, and what's the other one? I think it was clean.
Power clean, wasn't it?
I think it was just clean.
I got a feeling it was
just
Parkley.
clean. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's from CrossFit
Yeah.
football back in the day.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think the other thing with it as well though is, and this might be a little bit controversial, but arguably Olympic weightlifters are more athletic than powerlifters. If we think about athleticism, you know, in its purest form.
That's not controversial.
So then
at all.
obviously
that is like the most obvious thing.
Yeah. But then elite CrossFit Games athletes are athletic people, otherwise they wouldn't be there. So it's no surprise that the breadth of their athletic ability lends itself better to Olympic weightlifting, and they can get closer to Olympic weightlifting numbers than they can to powerlifting numbers.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
you know,
in powerlifting, one of the things I think people don't realise is for you to be able to generate that amount of force, you have to close off a lot of potential like energy leaks and this type of stuff. You literally need to reduce your movement options or your ability to do certain things for you to be so specialized in this one thing. So as an example, if you want to be able to squat the weights that, you know, elite powerlifters are doing, then you need to reduce like the potential movement of your spine and torso so that you're actually able to support those weights. Like you functionally become adapted to this type of stuff. Same, you know, like with, you know, if you want to be bench pressing elite numbers, you need to reduce the potential movement. Like this is not something someone's not actually trying to like, you know, write into their training program, but just the training of it will limit, you know, the potential movement and the excursion that you have within your shoulder. Whereas in weightlifting, you need more movement, and then arguably in CrossFit, you need more movement options with doing things like your gymnastics and, you know, running and all of this other stuff. So I think that's one of the things people don't realize. And then just by the training itself, you end up finding that like powerlifters are less athletic, maybe not less athletic, they have less options or whatever you want to call it, you know.
That might be a good way of putting it.
I think it was I listened to it on a podcast. Do you know Alan Thrall? Upside, I forget his name. No, it's not Upside Strength. Anyway, he's a YouTuber, strength guy into strongman, has a gym in the States, and he was saying, you know, the thing that he finds at like local strongman meets is that sort of separates people is athleticism. And he says sometimes you'll just get like a pretty strong CrossFitter who will just turn up and just do really well, or someone who's got a sports background, versus the people who are, you know, training very specifically for strongman, and they might do, you know, powerlifting strength work, but then some, you know, event practice and that type of stuff. Athleticism, important stuff. So let's go back into the how strong do you need to be in CrossFit, and I think at the elite level, it's a lot more variable in terms of those numbers that you need to be hitting. Just because I think once you get past, let's call it semifinals, regionals level, like I think once you get past that level, it's then about obviously trying to get those numbers higher, but being able to express it in a lot more scenarios. So someone might get themselves to the games and have, let's say, the strength numbers of a like medium level semifinals regional athlete, but their skill set and the ability for them to be able to hit those numbers under different situations and scenarios is just a lot more than those people who didn't qualify for the games. You know, I've seen it maybe several years ago. I think it was a max snatch event at the games, and there's like one guy in there, and I think it was like hitting, you know, 110 kilos. It was probably, you know, him having a bad day or what have you, and also probably did, you know, some fucking endurance workout the morning of that day. But, you know, as an example, that might be someone who just has a really broad skill set and is able to do all the other things, but their strength isn't on there. When we look at semi-finals though, or regionals, there is almost this sort of clear barrier to entry, and that might exist just from the weights that are being put on the barbells in the sort of qualifying stages of the CrossFit Games back in the day. So we'll base this conversation off of we've got games athletes, your sort of elite level. We've got semi-final athletes or old regionals, whatever you want to call that. And then below that, you have your top 10%. So we'll sort of use that marker that was used to be used for quarterfinals, because I feel like those are still some things that we can tangibly think about without, involving World Fitness Project and this and this and this and that. And I can't keep up with it.
No, it's endless now. Yeah.
So semi-finals athletes, numbers we've got here on the guys' side, and this is just based off of various data points, and then just maybe some little bit of anecdotal experience from us too. 110 to 115 are snatch on the guys' side, and then an 80 kilo snatch on the women's side, and then 145 clean and jerk on the men's side, and on the women's side 100 kilo clean and jerk. And I think we both know a little bit more intimately what those numbers are going to be like on the men's side, just because our own competition experience and us chasing those numbers and being aware of those things. But if someone's not able to hit those numbers, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to qualify to that level. There's probably just going to be a workout where the barbell reaches one of those weights and it's just like, okay, I can't do this. And in the open, that used to be, I think there was there was a couple of years where there was an ascending clean weight, or there was an ascending snatch weight, and I think it went up to like 100, it went up to like 125 kilos.
Yeah, just about.
Yeah, that one, yeah. And yeah, so like I think that if someone's just not able to hit those numbers, then likelihood is there's going to be a workout or something within the competition or the qualifying stages which will put their score down to the point where they're not able to qualify. Now with that said, what we're looking at in terms of these numbers isn't necessarily this is their 1 rep max in a competition, weightlifting style. This is more, they need to be able to do it in that situation, but then also in a situation where they're doing like a ladder, like the workout we just mentioned, where you have, I think it was increasing reps on chest to bar, and also
I know decreasing reps on snatch.
Decreasing reps on, was it squat snatch as well?
I think it might have been.
And in that workout the barbell went up to 125 kilos. The people who are making that weight, they're at the sort of elite level, but then the weight, sorry to just talking on the men's weights, just because I remember the workout, on the men's side is like the 255 or the 265, 255, 245, like those barbells were sort of just, I think there was actually a bigger jump there. Those barbells were probably going to be a little bit more, okay, if you're making that stage of the workout and you're doing pretty well in the other things, you're going to make it to the next level. And then in addition to that, it might be that you're actually having to hit those numbers after a metcon. So it might be you're doing a metcon like 2018, I think it was like the burpees and dumbbell squats, you're doing sort of 10 down one, and then after that you're going into a max clean. Also note as well, like with these numbers, we're looking at weightlifting numbers. Again, we're not looking at powerlifting numbers, but your powerlifting numbers are going, if you are performing them, if we're looking at push press, back squat, front squat, like a deadlift that's somewhat like more like a clean deadlift, those types of things are going to correlate pretty well to, they should, and hopefully if you're technically efficient enough, they should be helping your Olympic weightlifting numbers as you progress in those. What do you think of those numbers, Sam?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's fair. I think, like you say, there's always going to be that differentiation between what people can do for 1 rep fresh and what they can do at the end of a workout in all those different scenarios. I also think you're always going to have exceptions to that. Like if you think of, obviously, we know Sam Briggs pretty well, and she was never the strongest, but everything else she was so good at that even if she had one workout that she perhaps struggled with relative to other people at that level because of her strength, she would more than make up for on the other workouts, and there's enough of the other workouts for it to still bridge that gap. But I think as CrossFit developed as a sport, that got harder and harder to do. I think in the earlier years it was a little bit easier, but gradually as more and more people reach those top end weightlifting numbers on both sides, then that did get more difficult. I'd say, I think the women's side, varies more than the men's side. I think men tend to be more clustered together around certain numbers, whereas I think women, there is a little bit more variability in it, and whether that's to do with training backgrounds, coming into CrossFit, making that more spread, or other things, I'm not 100% sure, but there's definitely more variability on the women's side. I think the other thing on the men's side, and well, both sides to be honest, is looking at Olympic weightlifting numbers are there, but you've also then got other movements that they will use in semi-finals, for example, such as like when they did the heavy dumbbell snatches, and it's still a snatch, but it's how the different people will use their strength to then be able to handle a 50 kilo dumbbell snatch really well versus someone who handles it less well, even though the actual 1 rep max barbell snatch might be the same. And I think that's also part of that consideration when you get into that elite level that you don't really see at an open level because of the loads and the movements that they tend to use. So I think there's all those kind of things that factor into whether someone can make the highest level based on their numbers as opposed to just their 1 rep max.
Yeah, because you definitely get like, you got your sort of archetypes, right? And I think, I'm a perfect example of that, sort of someone who is more of a weightlifting specialist. But if it comes to that sort of like slow, grindy type strength endurance stuff, I'm terrible, and you're an example of that person who is going to be able to rip on a heavy dumbbell and, with absolute max weightlifting numbers, it would, you're probably looking at, there's going to be people who are fairly, a bit lighter than you, who are going to be hitting the same numbers as you. So there is definitely once you get past, like you said, once you get past a certain stage, your strength needs to be a little bit more all-encompassing.
Definitely.
It can be quite difficult because you end up sort of, as you're progressing through and as you're progressing an athlete through, you do have to have touches on this other type of strength work, but at the same time understand what it is that is going to be getting them to qualify for sort of the competition they want to do and getting them to sort of the next level, because you need to be pragmatic with it as well. I do remember, if you look at some of the sort of blog programs back in the day, I think like you would see on one side maybe the sort of like the old open programs or something like that. It would be weightlifting heavy, maybe some back squats in there for some general strength development, and then a hard metcon. And then the thing that you would see when it would be more of the regionals program or the whatever elite program, the things that would be included in that training would be a bit more, they'd have strongman Saturdays or some shit like that.
But I think when you're working with those elite athletes as well, once they get into that point where they're going to have to work disproportionately hard to add 2.5 kilo to their clean and jerk than somebody who's just starting out. So then when you think, well, actually, okay, you can already clean and jerk 150, 155. Are we going to get more in terms of overall strength development and useful strength development for CrossFit from spending perhaps a little bit less time on, say, your clean and jerk and more time on, say, strongman type stuff when it comes to a competition day? Or training your clean and jerk in different ways as opposed to just chasing a 1 rep max? Is that going to make you a better overall athlete?
Yeah. I think one of the things also to consider as well is we're talking very much around the training matching the competition. So we're thinking about, the movements that are included in competition versus, but there are certain things which, you can, there's a transfer to training. There are certain things that you can develop. You don't necessarily need to be doing a sandbag clean cycle because there's a high potential of sandbags being programmed in a certain workout, right? You can focus more on your deadlifts. You could be doing variations of deadlifts which are more challenging. It could be lifting from a more compromised position, working from a deficit, doing a double overhand so there's no hook or mixed grip, so you're challenging that with, let's say, I think squatting is tested via the barbell only, really. But pulling from the floor, I think pulling from the floor is going to be something which you need to be, you sort of just do, having more body weight does definitely help. Mass moves mass, for sure. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, like having a little bit more exposure to different types of pulling from the floor and hinging and those types of actions. I do remember actually, I think maybe it was from Training Think Tank, and they were talking about strengths that you need in CrossFit, and I think one of them, they were saying that lapping a sandbag, so essentially like a sandbag deadlift, like being able to sort of like, you know, hunch over, pick up a sandbag, put it on your lap, and then give it a hug and stand up. That might be a good little thing to just try to develop a little bit more, or use as a bit of a benchmark in terms of your strength. So similar to how we view, you know, your strict press, your bench press, your squat, your bench, I already said bench, your deadlift. Like, you could also view that maybe one other pulling variation could be like a sandbag lap. The issue with that is you're just not able to add weight. You're going to have to jump from, you know, however much to maybe 20 kilos more to the bag in the corner that's collecting dust. But those are definitely things that it's easy to just overlook them as well, because if you look at all the metrics, you know, when barbell spin, do whatever after an open or this or that, you know, the things that sort of do come up is going to be 5k times and max barbell lifts and, you know, benchmarks.
You're right. That's the stuff that everyone puts on Instagram too, hey?
Yeah.
That looks cool.
Yeah. I remember back in the day though, it was a little bit like people would be trying to do Turkish get-ups with a small human or something like that. But yeah. All right, so moving on, we're going to go into now numbers for this more sort of top 10%, this old quarterfinal cut line. The numbers we have, and I think this is going to be a lot more variable, but generally based off of some of the workouts that we've seen programmed in the past, and certain things like the clean complex, maybe from like 2021, I think it was like a clean deadlift, clean hang clean, shoulder to overhead type thing. For the snatch, on the men's side, we're looking at 185, on the women's side 125. So in kilos, that's 84 and 56. And then for the clean and jerk, on the men's side, we're looking at 255, on the women's side 175. So that's roughly 115 and 80 kilos. And within that, I would say that those are numbers just based off the tests that we see in the open. And this is obviously sort of the qualification for going into that top 10%. We're not looking at those max numbers fresh. We're looking at those max numbers under some fatigue. So it's either directly after a workout, you know, or it could be in the middle of a workout when you also have to, you know, also accumulate 100 toes to bar to be able to get to that barbell. So there's going to be some element of fatigue within that, and what you could consider these numbers to be would be more like the bottom level numbers, or your like everyday numbers. And one of the things as well, just as an anecdote, generally speaking, I think people are able to get around when they do a max out after a metcon. I think it's somewhere in the low 90s in terms of percentage of their 1 rep max. So when you are thinking about developing your numbers or training, right, you want those low 90s to be super solid, super consistent. You want to be making them every single time, because most likely that's going to be sort of around the number you finish on in a fatigued setting when you go for a max out. That's sort of like directly as a sort of maybe a part B of a workout where you have to do the metcon on beforehand.
I think with those people in this category as well is how well their technique holds up, because I feel like not everybody, but some people around this kind of level, when they get close to their maxes, especially under fatigue, they can have noticeable changes in technique, and that can really start to break down. Whereas I think the more elite athletes, they're much more consistent with that, regardless of how they're feeling. And I think that can have it. Like, if one of the workouts that stands out for me from a couple of years ago, it was the wall climb double under snatch, and then I think it went handstand push up double under snatch, and the weights of the snatches kept going up, and you would see people who could routinely hit, 90 kilo snatches. They'd go and try and snatch 80 kilo. I think it was 82.5 kilos in that workout, and it would just look horrific. And obviously that is that ability to withstand fatigue and maintaining your technique more than the actual strength to do the lift in a lot of those people. And like I say, I think you see that more in this group of athletes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is going to be where, looking at it more from when you are a beginner, you're trying to just really develop your skills. And I mean, I would say that, if you are looking at weightlifting purely from the perspective of just trying to just nudge those numbers forward, I would say that beginners shouldn't do lots of variations of weightlifting, because they want to develop their sort of classic lifts and their variations. But this is where, maybe throwing in learning how to do a no hook, no feet snatch, or, you're not going to be hitting maxes with those numbers, but maybe, let's say, having several variations of a snatch you're able to hit for, let's say, 60 to 70% with fairly solid technique. That's a good indication that your technique is going to be robust and good enough to be able to withstand situations where your grip's fucked, or you're not able to extend as much because you're just tired, you don't have as much power in your lift, so you sort of have to rely a bit more on staying connected to the bar. But from more of a weightlifting skill development perspective, I'd say that you are better off training the classic a little bit more, but then this is going to be the scenario where maybe a bit of variation can help to increase your sort of skill set. And you can have similar numbers, after, let's say, a good concerted effort to increase those numbers, you can have similar numbers. But what you can do is, rather than the numbers being the sort of the main direct way of progressing, you can just look to progress the difficulty of the movement. So the skill is the thing that you are progressing. And I found that to be particularly useful.
No, you're right. I think the skill, especially in people, and again, I don't know, maybe this comes back to guys more than girls as well, but when they're learning the skill of Olympic weightlifting, I think guys tend to start from a higher absolute strength level relative to women, because of the kind of things that they might have done prior to trying to learn to Olympic lift. So I think their biggest area of development, but also the thing that's going to set them up the best for the long term, is spending the time learning to lift properly with a couple of variations and being able to do it in, like, regardless of fatigue. And even, like, speaking from my own experience, like the first time, I think it was 2012 maybe, the first time I did regionals on the team, and there was the 50 kilo dumbbell snatches, and then the next day there was a 1 rep max snatch. And the 50 kilo dumbbell snatches were no problem for me whatsoever. The next day I struggled to snatch with a barbell 70 kilos. And that wasn't that's not a strength issue. And I'd say even when I was snatching 110 plus, like, my strength in terms of squats, deadlifts wasn't that much higher than then. But that's just the time spent developing the skill of snatching and the technique that comes with it that helped me add, 40 kilos onto your snatch. And that's the thing when you're a beginner that you need to focus on, as opposed to chasing numbers per se.
Yeah, and I tell you what, one of the things is quite interesting within this sort of, quite difficult to understand until you sort of felt it as well, is that you might look at a lift from years ago and it's your max, and your max maybe, let's say, increases 20-30 kilos. The technique doesn't necessarily look too different from the outside, but the technique is so much better, especially if, say, for example, your absolute strength, your squats and your deadlifts and those types of things haven't increased at the same level. But your technique is so much better because you're able to handle those weights, and maybe the outside picture is looking the same, but it's developed a lot, if that makes sense. So let's just say, like the situation you're talking about, right, where you're snatching 110 plus versus you're snatching 70. Maybe like the outside picture of what you're lifting like isn't that different, but it is so much better because there is so many little nuances and little things within the lift that you have to just get the reps under your belt, or you have to just coach people through it to really appreciate it. I found this particularly when I just decided just to focus on weightlifting for about a year, that my lifts just felt so much snappier and crisper. And that was just from snatch and clean and jerking, like every day, 5 days a week. It's in some variety or form. It's just getting those reps in, and it might be something like you notice that obviously your numbers will increase and stuff, but little things like, rather than doing warm-up sets muscle snatch into power snatch into full snatch into drop snatch, whatever, with 40 kilos, you're doing it with 50 kilos. And it's just like these little things that you can, I would say that you don't, like a lot of people, they think, oh, right, I'm going to improve my technique and I want it to look like this weightlifter I saw on, All Things Gyms, like Instagram. And it's like, it's probably not going to happen. But like the numbers itself is going to be the indication that your technique has improved.
Yeah, for sure.
So thinking about obviously these numbers, thinking about the different sort of levels of, playing the game and what type of strength you sort of need, and what are those max numbers in relation to your powerlifters and your Olympic weightlifters. One of the things we can start to look at is what is the training going to look like, or what are the priorities going to be. And we touched on this a little bit in some previous episodes where we were talking about these sort of less like hypothetical life cycle of an athlete and what type of strength work they need to be doing. And this is somewhat similar in terms of what we're looking at, but on that beginner level, if we're looking at trying to achieve those numbers with all of the different inputs and the different situations and scenarios that are going to come up in your qualifier workouts, there's going to be a big emphasis on skill development. And like we were saying, it's trying to make sure that you are refining that skill early on and really developing it and just getting as much strength development from that as possible. You might actually have a bit slower progress if you don't attack your absolute strength as directly in the beginning. However, you are going to be establishing a real strong base for you to then sort of put that intensity in later on when it's a bit more appropriate to do so. So you could say this is like building the cup, as it were. And for those people who are watching on YouTube, I have here a cup. So that's the early stages. The next is going to be about developing your absolute strength. And luckily, when you're at that sort of more intermediate stage, if your absolute strength numbers go up, you're probably going to see an increase in things like strength, endurance, and that type of stuff as well. You can follow a little bit more of a traditional strength program, have a little bit more variety in there with CrossFit, throw around a sandbag, do lots of sort of strongman type stuff on the side. Those types of things are going to make your strength development pretty well rounded. And you could imagine filling the cup. And then beyond that, what we're looking at that sort of more, let's call it, I would say, that like semi-final level and above, we're looking at trying to develop your strength in a more well-rounded way. Actually making some concerted effort to develop different types of strength or different sort of skills within strength. Your strongman type stuff being sort of a prime example. But you also need to be able to develop, you also need to be able to express all of this strength under extreme levels of fatigue, and you need to be very robust and be able to tolerate a lot of volume. And I think that when people think of these sort of classifications or sort of characterizations of CrossFit as being an endurance sport, I'd say that it's a little bit more of like a robustness sport. Like your strength needs to be robust enough that you can call on it, at sort of any given point after you've done a half marathon row the day before, after you've just run it was like a 10 kilometer trail that they did back in 2016, something like that. And then you're going into, you go into a deadlift ladder. So that's the sort of type of strength that you need. And when you get to that stage, there's going to be so much training that you've gone through to get there that your understanding of your strength, what you have, or if you're coaching people through this, you're just going to know what it is that they need to develop. And generally in that stage, you're always working on the same things. And it just might be that you have a couple of sort of classic hits in terms of training programs that you would deploy that are going to work and yield good results. They come off a competition, you put on the hits, you get them strong, you see where you can get, and year on year, you're sort of, let's call it around those same numbers. You're not expecting 10 kilo increases on numbers and that type of stuff. Not to break any hearts out there. But like
it'd be nice to hear.
But oh man, just add 2 kilos every week and you'll be fine, right? That's how it works, right?
Oh, sweet. Yeah.
but you're just looking at getting to those similar numbers each year. Obviously, a nice little bit of progression is going to be good along the way, just in a more well-rounded position, and letting competition sort of be the guide of, okay, this exposed you. You need to do this. And to be honest with you, the sport itself probably progresses at a rate where there's always a new challenge. There's always a new thing that you need to just figure out. And that usually that is the thing that takes up sort of the training priorities, as it were.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, around that intermediate stage is always quite an interesting one, because I think they've learned the skill of the movement by that point, but they might not have challenged it completely because they've spent so much time, or not so much time, but because their focus has been learning the skill. Whereas then I think then they get to that intermediate stage, and there might be other things that you start to notice as a coach that you've not been able to see because the load hasn't been high enough to expose them. And I mean that in probably like two different ways. I think the first thing is, again, looking at that difference between someone who is very good when it comes to absolute strength but struggles with rate of force development, whereas before they've not been lifting heavy enough weights to really see that that's something that they've struggled with in that intermediate stage. Now that they're more capable, then that might give you a direction for improvement further down the line. But I think the other thing in that stage as well, which I've seen, and probably especially as I've gone more down like the physio route and looked at things with those eyes as opposed to just a strength and conditioning mindset as well, is when you see in people's movement patterns inefficiencies that might come from more than just knowing how to do the lift, and stem more from something more to do with the way that their own body moves. And then again, it's how you can bridge those gaps or close those gaps to give them more consistent progress further down the line.
Yeah. So if someone's like shoulder mobility is very limited, you're not going to be encouraging them to dive bomb under the bar. I mean, sometimes I've got one athlete who's got pretty tight shoulders, and I tell him, I'm like, try to power snatch it. Just try to power snatch it, and then you'll ride it down and find a point. But if you try to dive under the bar, you're just going to miss out in front every time, because
it's things like that. And obviously I think things like shoulder mobility you see quite early, but then there's the more nuanced things like scapular movement or hip instability, things like that, which if an athlete has the strength to snatch 80 kilos, but they've only ever snatched 60 kilos, you don't see that till they get to 75 to 80 kilos, which when they're a beginner, you're just not going to see because they're not exposed to it. And sometimes that could be quite frustrating for people, because it's some of the work that they might have to do to fix that can be quite specific and boring, but it's helping them see that actually, if you can get through this point now, you're going to get from 80 kilos to 100 kilos faster than you got from 60 to 80. You just got to ride it out a little bit and work on those things. And like you said in the last one, it's giving people the longest possible runway to keep progressing, which by the time they get to an elite level, most of those things are ticked off. And like you say, you go back to having a lot of breadth to your training, and you're looking at testing lots of different things based on the demands of the competition.
Yeah, I think that when you're thinking about this from more of a, we're talking very much in big hypotheticals here and everything like that. Like we're saying, okay, well, this is going to be a nice little runway to go through. The chances of that actually happening though are like zero. Like this never happens. So it's a nice like theoretical way of thinking about it, but it's also understanding, these things don't really occur. So it's just having the ability to sort of problem solve and stay agile as you go through that. But I think one of the things also is just understanding when maybe strength development is not going, like it's just not the thing to do, because some people's strength just slows down, and it could be lifestyle factors. It could just be like someone, I don't know, like they're just always underslept and always overstressed and that type of stuff. And it's sort of like, we can obviously optimize this training as much as possible, but sometimes those things are going to come in play. And I'm never a fan of like always blaming it on those things. I know some coaches out there will blame everything on fucking gut health, but but
It's true though. Makes
I know it does, but like, I mean, I'm a coach. I'm not there. I'm not there to tell people to chew their food 50 times so it helps their digestion, which helps their strength. No, like we're not there to do that. But with that said, there is obviously, there might be a situation in that strength development is just not on the cards for that time, and it might be just you're better off spent doing something else. It doesn't always have to be a priority.
No, it literally has to be what's going to make the biggest difference right now.
Yeah.
And that isn't always strength. That can be a number of things. But I think sometimes people subconsciously want it to be strength because it seems like a logical thing. And it can be more interesting, and working on your squats might be more fun than working on your shoulder mobility. But again, in the long run, what's going to get you further forward?
Squats, for sure.
Exactly. 100%. And if you struggle with your shoulder, just do overhead squats. It's fine.